Hello. Today I'm going to talk about the Ukraine. Well, what else is there to talk about? I've already tried to understand that word that is not one that's been very much used, I think. I've already tried to understand President Putin, and I did a lengthy video on that. I didn't call him names. I didn't denounce him as being mad. Instead, I simply tried to understand him in terms of his own values, the way in which I'm convinced he sees himself, in fact, it's clear, he said it explicitly, he sees himself as a new czar, destined, determined to restore the glories of Tsarist Russia, of which the conquest of the Ukraine by the great Tsar Peter the Great, he gets up to the river Dnieper on which Kiev, on which the capital stands, and that Tsar actually has got there's an image of him, a bronze statuette in Putin's own office. It's the equivalent of his Churchill, and of course it's the other great Tsar, rather than Tsarina, Catherine the Great, who conquers the western half of the Ukraine, and her general Alexander Suvorov, who takes the Baltic coast from the Ottoman Empire. Putin sees himself as the heirs of these people, vindicating them and reclaiming their inheritance. In other words, he sees himself as a Tsar and Russia as a naturally, intrinsically, rightly imperial power. We've already discussed Putin. I'm going to do something I think more difficult. I'm going to try and talk now about his opponent, about Volodymyr Zelensky, who, interestingly enough, is actually, first of all, a Russian speaker, and in Russian, his name is the same, Vladimir, as that of Putin himself. And I'm going to dare to suggest that there isn't as much contrast between the two as we in the West have liked to think. Now, don't get me wrong. Obviously, I think this is as near a contest between good and evil as one can possibly imagine. That is not the question. The question is, what are the values that actually activate them? And because, of course, we are on the side, rightly on the side of the Ukrainians, led by Zelensky, we tend to think, well, they're sort of like us. And to a significant extent, they want to be. They want to join the EU. They would have loved to have been in NATO and all the rest of it. But there are differences. And I want to explore those differences. And I want to argue, in fact, that it's precisely their unlikeness from us, and to an extent their likeness to Putin, which accounts for the success of their resistance. Because just think again about those scenes, the scenes now which are engraved on the mind of the world, the very, very first stages of the Russian invasion, when the handful of troops on Snake Island are challenged by the Russians, surrender, or we will shoot you to pieces. They sort of turn to each other and in the language of soldiers, which I won't fully repeat, sort of say, oh, okay, right, it's come to this. What should we say to them? And they say, well, F off. And the first reports were that having told the Russians what they could do, they're then shot to pieces. The argument is now, the evidence is now, that perhaps they survived. But again, that sense of the heroic, and I'm going to keep coming back to that word, the heroic, the handful against the multitude. Zelensky himself, he's offered an escape from what are clearly the mounting horrors of his capital, of his country. What does he say? Pfft, I want ammunition, not a ride. Now, that's not Churchill. Churchill's rhetoric is much more Latin, it's much more formal, it's much more carefully rehearsed. This is the kind of brilliant off-the-cuff remark of what Zelensky was. He was a stand-up comic, but it's genuine, to use that word again, heroism. The leader sharing the suffering of his people, there not formally dressed in, not even in military fatigues. He's not doing a Michael Portillo or a Margaret Thatcher. He's wearing khaki, but just a t-shirt, there with his people in the thick of it. This is remarkable. This is not, I think, dare I say it, terribly like us. To find it like us, you've got to go back to, well, you've got to go back to the 18th century. In the 18th century, we had leaders like that. We had somebody like General Wolfe leading the British troops who are seeking to conquer what was seen as the virtually impregnable city of Quebec in French Canada, with the great river and on its massive outcrop, and nevertheless doing it, but dying as his troops take the city on the plains of Abraham. Of course, even more famously, that other great death at the moment of victory, Nelson dying on the quarterdeck of victory at Trafalgar. And Nelson, of course, being the one who puts all this into words. Nelson himself, when he's an 18-year-old boy, 18-year-old young man, recovering from a bad bout of malaria, has some sort of vision in which he describes himself as experiencing this great rush, this passion of patriotism, this realization that he would devote his life to the service of his king and his country. But he formulates it in a different way. He formulates it in this intensely personal way. Well then, he remembers himself as saying, "I will be a hero, and with the assistance of Providence, I will brave every danger." Isn't that Zelensky? Isn't that handful of soldiers at Snake Island? Now, what are they doing? Let's forget for the moment that we'll go back to Wolfe and we'll go back to Nelson. Let's go back to the Ukrainians. What are they doing? What gives them this extraordinary courage? Are they fighting, as Western leaders have kept on going about? Are they fighting for a rules-based international order? Are they fighting for international law? Are they fighting for universal human rights? Are they fighting even for the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court? Do you know what? I don't actually think so. Do you? I think if we want to understand them, we need to explore that word heroism more and to look where it comes from. Of course, it comes from first the Greek via the Latin. And it is in that world of Greece and Rome, the figures of Hercules or of Theseus, or particularly, I think, in the context we're talking about now, the handful of men defending their country against an overwhelming force with staggering courage and the willingness to throw away their lives. It's Roman. And the particular Roman I have in mind is a Roman who is immortalized, Horatius, who is immortalized in the poem by Lord Macaulay, the mid-Victorian sage, historian, all sorts of things, but actually rather a fine poet. And he describes the moment of Horatius, his great moment of, again, it's theatrical. I don't think there's any accident, again, with Zelensky. He is a man of the theatre. He is performing the role of leader and performing it astonishingly well, in the same way, of course, as Churchill, without the direct physical courage in the Second World War, though he showed plenty in the First. He was, he actually, after he'd lost office, after the catastrophe of the Dardanelles, he actually serves as an officer in the First World War. But this is Zelensky acting the role of leader. Well, Horatius is acting the role of leader. The city of Rome, this is these are the myths of Livy and whatever, the city of Rome has thrown out its king, thrown out the great house of Tarquin that supplied its monarchs, and there's an attempt at restoring them by Lars Porsena of Clusium. By the seven gods he swore that the great house of Tarquin would suffer wrong no more. So this vast army is bearing down on Rome, and a single thing stands between the city and them, which is a single wooden bridge. Will they have time to get that bridge down to stop this vast army penetrating the city? And suddenly the troops appear, the drums, the trumpets sound, and the city is at risk of being overwhelmed. What Horatius does, he turns to the consul and says, "Let me stand in the breach," just like those handful of soldiers at Snake Island, just like Zelensky himself. And this is how he describes it. Listen carefully. This is what Macaulay puts in the mouth of Horatius as he steps forward to save his city on the bridge to the consul. "To every man upon this earth death cometh soon or late, and how can man die better than facing fearful odds for the ashes of his fathers and the temples of his gods, and for the tender mother who dandled him to rest, and for the wife who nurses his baby at her breast, and for the holy maidens who feed the eternal flame, to save them from false Sextus that wrought the deed of shame." Then he turns, that sense of, I've got to die sometime. Let me die now, just like those men at Snake Island, you know. God. He's saying it more poetically. So, "Hew down the bridge, Sir Consul, with all the speed you may. I, with two more to help me, will hold the foe in play. In yon straight path 1,000 may well be stopped by 3. Now, who will stand on either hand and keep the bridge with me?" That extraordinary sense. Life's cheap. We've got to die sometime. Let's die nobly. Well, as I said, it doesn't have very much to do with human rights or International Women's Day or BLM or any of those things at all, does it? The first thing that strikes you is, of course, it's toxic masculinity, isn't it? This is aggressive male preening behaviour. In other words, this isn't really uncomfortable, isn't it? Or it should be. Let's look at how Zelensky is also presenting himself. There have been shots of him doing a workout with what? Hugely heavy weights, you know? Real masculine pumping iron stuff. There are other shots which I cannot describe fully from his days as a stand-up comedian. Perhaps the phrase actually should be stand-out comedian, since he is shown playing the pianoforte with an impressively large sexual organ. Anyway, but you see what I mean? This really is toxic masculinity, isn't it? We don't approve that kind of thing here. In fact, just driving the point home a little bit, we actually sack people for it. Referring to somebody else of the exact contemporary of Nelson is, of course, the Duke of Wellington, who is responsible for the great land victory. Nelson responsible for the victory of Trafalgar, Wellington responsible for the victory of Waterloo. And he says the victory of Waterloo is won upon the playing fields of Eton, you know, toughness, masculinity, an elite that schooled in rough sport. Well, Eton has changed a bit, hasn't it? It's recently sacked a master, Will Noland, for doing what? Giving a lecture on toxic masculinity, being seen doing a workout with heavy weights. But here is Zelensky doing all that. And the comparison's even more awkward, isn't it? Because, well, what is Putin seen doing? Well, he's constantly seen, isn't he, or was seen, with his shirt off, pumped up, somebody either with steroids or does weights, preening himself with toxic masculinity, taking on, allegedly, a bit like Henry VIII in the tilt yard, again, somebody else playing the hero, taking on all comers in ice hockey, which is one of the roughest of games. Now, this is, you know, both of them, in other words, both Putin and Zelensky are playing the toxic masculine game, as we put it here. And again, look at those lines here. For the tender mother who dandled him to rest, and for the wife who nurses his baby at her breast, and for the holy maidens who feed the eternal flame. The woman on one side doing all these things, mother, priestess, wife, the man, the fighter. Well, it has actually been a little bit like that in the Ukraine, hasn't it? The men have all been commanded to stay at home. No man has been allowed to leave. They've all been recruited to the army. They've all been armed. And women and children have been allowed, and in many cases, encouraged to leave. The old distinction, the thing that, we all imagine happened, even if we rather suspect that it didn't. As the Titanic went down, women and children first, the different roles. Not, I'm afraid, like our mixed armed forces. So part of what is driving the events in the Ukraine is this notion of straightforward male virtue. What should a man do? What should his reaction be in the face of danger? And by the way, it's also the fact that this is possible there because you've had a population which was already, arms were by no means universal, but they were quite widely distributed, and there was the practice of hunting and all the rest of all the things, of course, which are heavily deterred in peaceful modern Britain because we regard all that kind of thing as terribly bad, and we trust, of course, our police force to protect us, don't we? So toxic masculinity, the one side of the story. The other side, I think, is what is that toxic masculinity invoked in favour of? Well, Nelson here again tells us very clearly it's invoked in favour of patriotism. Similarly, with Wellington, when he's talking about the playing fields of Eton, there is this idea that it is rough sport and whatever, which is designed consciously as a training for war in the service of the British state, and at that point, therefore, the British Empire. Patriotism, nationalism, I think, you will find that that's exactly what is driving the Ukrainians. They are driven by a visceral, passionate attachment and love to their country. And it is one that will brook no challenge. It is one that they are prepared to die for, and it is one that they are prepared to kill for, and it is one that they have absolutely no doubts about why they're doing it. Now, oh dear, look at our agonies about our own senses of patriotism, the way in which we misquote constantly Dr. Johnson about patriotism being the first refuge of the scoundrel, the way in which we constantly elide from patriotism to xenophobia, to racism, to all of these things that we shouldn't have, because, well, we believe, don't we, that we are really all internationalists, that everybody is the same, or at least that we should all be the same. I think you will find that the Ukrainians don't. Remember, there isn't really much more than a sheet of paper between them and the Russians. Yeah. The Ukraine was called Little Russia. It's given its, Putin is right in all of this, it's given its shape and everything else by Russia, by the Russian Empire. But they've decided they want to be different. They are inventing themselves as a nation. As I've said, Zelensky himself is a Russian. He's a Russian Jew. He's a Russian speaker. But he's reinventing himself as the leader of what, with lots and lots of not terribly, well, very, very old history. The role of the first quasi-Russian state at Kiev, founded at Kiev rather than Moscow, but overwhelmed in the great invasions of the Tartars and whatever. So there's a tiny kernel of history there, but this is effectively a newly invented state and a newly invented nationhood with all of the passions of those things. So, once again, nationalism, fervent, bloody-minded patriotism. You see, I don't think, although they understand it differently, clearly, Putin Putin shares this world. Putin sees himself as a great Russian patriot. He sees, of course, Russian patriotism as imperial. Zelensky sees the patriotism of the Ukraine as a defensive nation-state patriotism rather than a great imperial patriotism. But the emotion, the feeling, that sense of the homestead, the landscape, mine, my family, my territory, my wife, my children, my place in the world, the things I value, the things I value so much that I'm prepared to kill for them and to die for them. You see, I think that really is the same. And it is 1,000 miles from most of us, isn't it? Zelensky has appealed desperately for us to declare a no-fly zone or whatever. What have we said? No, we won't take the risk. We haven't stepped up at Snake Island, and I have to confess, I am very pleased. I don't want the world to disappear into a nuclear holocaust. I don't want a war that will cost thousands, tens of thousands of lives, to turn into a war that will cost millions and tens of millions and perhaps even civilization itself. But let's not pretend that the values are the same. And let's not pretend, I think, that our own values haven't changed. If we go back, I'm arguing, to the 18th century, when I've been talking about those heroes, when I've been talking about Wolfe, when I've been talking about Nelson, when I've been talking even to a significant extent about Wellington himself, we were prepared to do that. They were prepared to die in that fashion. They were prepared to take those extraordinary risks. And indeed, the English stood out as exemplifying exactly the kind of things that Zelensky has shown. The combination of aggressive masculinity on the one hand and an absolute passionate patriotism and a willingness, that phrase, to make the final sacrifice. And it was spotted by the people that the English clean up because of those virtues, that's to say the French. There's a remarkable play which is performed in Paris in the 1760s. It's called The Siege of Calais. You may remember that there's the famous statue by Rodin showing the burglar, I always used to call them the burglars of Calais when I was a boy, the burghers of Calais, who, when the city is surrendered, after they've resisted the English king, Edward III, because they have resisted a man who claims to be their liege king, they are in theory guilty of treason, therefore the entire population could be massacred, and Edward instead demands the sacrifice of the lives of the leading citizens who are paraded before him, stripped to their shirts, ready to be hanged, until his queen Philippa kneels and pleads for their lives. So that great scene, represented by Rodin, played out in this much earlier play in the 18th century by a man called de Bellois. And it's not a great play, but it captures all of these ideas of heroism, of the idea of patriotism, and of the idea of the Englishman as particularly exemplifying it. But what I think is most interesting of all, this is in 1760s, this is the height of the Enlightenment. This is the height of the new languages, the new ideas. I've said all bad ideas are French. The new ideas, particularly of people like Rousseau, the ideas that the essence is the essence of the world is freedom, that we must have the right to be free. Remember that, the absurd opening of Rousseau's greatest book, Man is born free, yet everywhere is he in chains, as I constantly say. Man, and indeed not even woman, is born free. We are helpless creatures, as St. Augustine says, We are born amidst excrement and urine, amidst piss and shit, if one translates the Latin accurately. We are weak and feeble creatures. We need washing, we need feeding, we need tending, we need clothing, not for months, not for weeks, not for months, for years. So the notion of intrinsic human freedom is a preposterous one, but of course it is there with this equally dangerous idea that the state is founded simply on individuals getting together, signing a contract in their own self-interest. And these individuals, moreover, are the same wherever they are, that there is a notion of a kind of universal human being with universal rights and universal values and a universal system of law binding them together. All that, in other words, what we think of now as the standard liberal worldview, the idea of fundamentally that, as I said, that human beings are the same, that there is a system of international law, that there are universal human rights. All that is invented in the middle of the 18th century by Frenchmen, by Montesquieu on the one hand and by Rousseau on the other. And interestingly, de Bellois understands that the English of the 18th century stand on the other side of the argument. They stand against this notion of universalism. They instead believe in the specificity of patriotism. And he puts it brilliantly. And he associates this idea again of the hero, of the virtue of patriotism with Englishness. The Englishman, he says, is a citizen, and the spirit and logic of his life proclaim the idea, listen to this, that a nation should love herself. Patriotism, that's what it means. La patrie is the nation, but it's stronger than the nation. It's the native land. It's that sense of the belonging, the soil that feeds you, the soil where your ancestors lie, the soil where you too will be buried, the soil that produces the crops, the flowers, the scents, the life. And he goes on. It is therefore only natural that one feels more closely tied to one's compatriots than to people of other nations. And suddenly the rhetoric goes up. I hate the cold hearts which feel nothing for their country, men and women who observe their country's misery with the greatest detachment. Does the idea of the Remainer come in mind? With the greatest detachment, and claim for themselves the proud name of a citizen of the world, pretending under all possible circumstances to love humanity so that they may, let's get this right, pretending under all possible circumstances to love humanity so that they do not need to serve their own city. David Goodhart, somewheres and anywheres. Even Theresa May, one phrase that she might be remembered for, those who are citizens of everywhere are citizens of nowhere. Well, you know, it touches home, doesn't it? The people of the Ukraine are not citizens of anywhere. They are citizens of the Ukraine. They're prepared to die for it, for that land, for those great rich fields, huge, huge rolling fields of dark black soil that used to feed Russia, that produce getting on between those and the immediate territories to the east of them in Russia that produce about a third of the world's grain exports. That's what they're fighting for. That past, that city, themselves, their wives, and their children. Would we do it? I wonder. Hello, and thank you for watching David Starkey Talks. If, as I very much hope, you're enjoying them, why not become more actively involved and join my members club? As a member, you'll be able to take part in the members-only weekly question and answer session, suggest topics for forthcoming videos, and have priority booking for my forthcoming live events. And while you're at it, why not have a look at the store page on my website, davidstarkey.com. There you can purchase t-shirts and other merchandise, buy signed copies of my books, and, if you're feeling brave and a bit flush, even arrange to take me out to lunch. Thank you once again for watching. I look forward to hearing from you and to welcoming you to my members club.